I had never been to a coffee farm before, and I had no idea how far down the rabbit hole we were about to go. Now, visiting a coffee farm in Guatemala is something that Sarah and I had talked about for nearly a decade back, almost all the way to when we first got married. And when we had the chance to visit Finca Catalan, which is a direct trade partner of Pilot Coffee Roasters in Toronto, both one of our favorite producers and one of our favorite roasters right in Toronto, we jumped at the chance. We had a quick connection in Texas, grabbed a Americano at Counterculture right there in the terminal, and then we were on our way down to Guatemala City, Guatemala. So it was a Friday night when we landed, and the owner of Finca Catalan, Nico Hammond, picked us up at the airport, and of course it was rush hour, so getting out of Guatemala City was a bit of a hassle. Normally driving out to the farm, which is near San Martin, would take about, 2.5 hours, but on this night, it took closer to 4 hours to get there. Now that wasn't all bad because we've been a fan of Nico for a long time, so we had a lot to talk about, and the drive was totally gorgeous. They call Guatemala the land of eternal spring. As we were driving, the sun was setting and we got these amazing views of mountains and volcanoes that are surrounding the area. It was totally gorgeous. So by the time we actually pulled into the farm, it was dark. We went to bed and we got up the next morning and we were treated to our very first views of Finca Catalan. We stayed in this guest house that was actually designed by Nico's mother, who is an architect. And this farm had been in his family for several generations. And if you want to hear a little bit more from Nico, we actually had the chance to interview him and his wife, Angie. And I'm going to be releasing a video. Would love for you to check that out. They're fantastic. And hearing the story of their farm and how it came to be is pretty cool. As soon as we got hanging out with Nico and Angie, we felt this almost immediate kinship with them. They're a young family in their mid-30s. They got kids exactly the same age and stage as us, and they do an incredible job cultivating not just the land of their farm, but the community that they built around it as well. The farm itself is about 200 hectares with 165 hectares of that going to coffee, and the remainder going to things like pine and cattle. And the growing region for the coffee itself is about 1,800 meters to about 2,200 meters. And up on the higher end of the elevations, there's Bourbones, very nice red and yellow Bourbones, stuff like that growing. But he also has Marigojipe, Pacamara, and Geisha growing up there. And in fact, some of those higher altitudes at Finca Catalan are actually some of the highest altitudes across the whole country of Guatemala that exist for growing coffee. So our first day at the farm started with a tour. Nico took us around this wet mill that he had put on the farm in 2014. And this is something that is used to get that outer part of the fruit off of the coffee beans themselves so that they can dry naturally in the elements. And this is called a washed processing. A lot of the coffees that you've probably enjoyed are processed this way, but seeing it in real life was really cool. Once it makes it through all these different components of this wet mill to get that fruit off of, it's actually sent out onto the drying patios to either dry right there on the patio or on these raised drying beds, depending on the coffee that's being dried. And this wet mill is actually the only wet mill in this region in the mountains of Guatemala. Prior to this, most of the farms in the area are very small, 1 acre or less, and most of the farmers would need to bag up their coffee cherries, hop on a bus, and travel a very long way to have their coffee sold or milled. And what has happened since this wet mill is put in place is Nico and his farm have been kind of a hub of the community where farmers can take their coffee there. They don't have to travel nearly as far, and they can sell their coffee, have it processed locally, which is fantastic. And in fact, as we were there, we could see all of these farmers bringing their coffee on these trucks to be processed by the wet mill at the farm. Some of this coffee even gets sold to companies like Starbucks, Tim Hortons, that type of thing. Most of the crops that are actually grown at Finca Catalan, those nice Bourbons and some of those other varieties that I mentioned, they get processed there as well, but they tend to get sold to Nico's direct trade partners, including Pilot. Now, after the tour, we had a cupping session with a co-worker of Nico's named Carlos and his nephew Pablo, and this was really cool to get to try some of their coffees side by side, and just watching the way Carlos moved, it was so obvious he was an expert. And even though he didn't speak English, we had Nico and Angi translating for us, and it was incredible to be able to learn from him. After that, we went over to the Seedling Nursery, which is really cool. This is where the coffee plants start growing. They're under this mesh shade to be able to give them the ideal growing conditions before they're planted out into the farm. Very cool to see all these, baby coffee plants at various stages of growing, getting ready to be planted. And then after that, this was a big surprise for us. We walked over to an education center that Nico had built on the farm. Now, this was an amazing moment. This education center provides better education and healthcare than a lot of these kids can actually get in their home communities. Many of the workers at Catalan are local, they come up from the town down the hill, it's called San Martin, but other ones from a lot further away. Now, very often coffee pickers are paid by weight, like how much coffee did they actually pick? That's how much you get paid. And that unfortunately can result in some cases kids getting brought out to pick by their parents, which is obviously not a good situation because then they don't get their education. What Nico does at Catalan is he pays a flat day rate. So no matter how much you pick, you're going to get paid the same amount. And this really enables parents to keep their kids in school because he's not going to allow for kids to come out and get paid to pick. And for those seasonal workers, their families can actually come with them and they get health exams, healthcare that is more on the level of a private school and is a lot better than they would be getting. In some cases, they don't even get any education at home. And this is the only education that they get all year. Suffice to say, we were really caught off guard by the tenderness of this space. It was really amazing to see. After that, we walked up into the higher altitude regions of the farm where the coffee trees are actually getting grown. And it was amazing to walk along with Nico. He would, pluck these cherries off the plants and say, hey, taste this. And it would be like this vibrant note of, I remember this Pacamara tasted exactly like banana. Such rich, vibrant flavors, and just tasting them one after the next. It was so cool. Then eventually he brought us around to this hillside where you could look down and we could actually see the farmhouse way down there where we were staying. And he said, I'm actually going to have you guys pick so you can experience this. And this was a really cool moment. It was kind of funny because it was absolutely hard work, but the coffee nerd in me was just having a blast. And it was hard and in some ways unpleasant, but for me it just was such a rich experience to be able to share this daily routine that really is quite difficult that pickers will do so that we can enjoy our cup of coffee. You have to go along the branch and pick only the ripe cherries and really be quite careful. You can't do it quickly. It is a very slow, very hot process. You're getting poked by branches and there's bugs. And I'm sure some of Nico's pickers would have laughed if they could see us at how slow we actually were. But, we picked for 45, 50 minutes and we had these very modestly sized baskets full of coffee. A lot of the coffee that you drink, especially if it's higher quality, is likely picked by hand. So the next time you open a bag of coffee, I just want you to look in there and imagine each one of those cherries getting picked by a picker in one of these farms. Having actually gone and picked, it really gives you a different perspective on your cup of coffee. So by the time we wrapped up, the sun was setting. Angi had actually driven up to the ridge on a truck, brought a couple beers, and we just got to watch the sunset. At this point, we had only really been here for 24 hours, but it really felt like this was the beginning for Sarah and I think Nico and Angi would probably agree, of a new, long-lasting friendship. These are young entrepreneurs. They have kids right in the same stage as we do. They have joys and struggles in their life just like we do. And it was cool to just be able to connect with them on this friendship level over beers on the ridge of their farm. Once the sun actually set, which was gorgeous, we went back down, had a wonderful dinner, and then went to bed. The next morning we got up again. After breakfast, we had that chance to sit down with Nico and Angi and ask them what it is like to own and run a coffee farm. And like I said, I'm going to be releasing this video later, and I'll link to it once I do that. After that, we had another cupping session, and this time I had actually asked if we could cup some defects. Cupping for defects is something that cuppers at Origin will do to kind of sort through and grade coffee, and it's not actually something that you really have an opportunity to do very well in Canada or the United States once the coffee is actually here, because in most cases by that point, kind of a lot of the defective coffee has already been flagged and sorted out. So to be able to taste some of these different defects with Carlos and Pablo, Nico and Angi, it was really neat to be able to say, hey, this is that defect and this is that defect. These are how they taste. Very cool. And then after that, just as we were starting to feel at home, it was time to leave the farm. And that was kind of a sad moment for us because we really felt like we could have stayed for a lot longer and really just hung out. It was really, really fun. Our next few days were spent in beautiful Antigua, Guatemala, which is the historical capital of Guatemala. Beautiful city, very historic, kind of touristy, but it was fun to do the tourist thing. The city is right under this volcano, Volcan Agua, just towers over the city. We actually had the chance to walk up to this lookout and take a couple pics, and you can actually see the whole city just laid out in front of you. We also sponsor a couple kids through Compassion Canada. We sponsored them for nearly a decade, and we had the chance to meet both of them on this trip. Now, for confidentiality reasons, we're keeping photos and videos of this section of our trip private, but we love our kids. It was such an honor to get to meet their families in person as well, and Compassion is really doing some good work. In our downtime in the city, we walked, back and forth across the city, going to markets and squares and cafes. I hit up a cafe called Dos Onzas several times. It was a super fun cafe and even brought some coffee back with me. And it was really nice to be able to wrap up our trip on that note. After a couple nights in Antigua, Guatemala, it was time to head back to Guatemala City the night before our flight, and then we were heading home. It was full but not hurried. It really was the trip of a lifetime for us in a lot of ways, and I certainly hope it's not the last as well. Thanks for coming on the journey with us. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next week.